It happened once before.
Some muggers followed my wife and daughter home from the market.
It's about to happen again.
The police there got a very good description of the muggers, too. But it didn't do any good.
We do what we can.
And so does he.
Is this your daughter, Mr. Kersey? Mr. Kersey, is that Carol?
When murder and rape are the crimes, Bronson is the only punishment. Charles Bronson, Death Wish 2.
There's something else you should know, sir. Paul Kersey now lives in Los Angeles.
Oh, my God.
Now you tell me there's a vigilante out there.
You believe in Jesus?
Yes, I do.
Well, you're going to meet him.
He killed 9 people in New York City 4 years ago. The people he killed were muggers. He became a hero.
What did he look like?
He was a very good citizen, that's what he was.
That guy saved our lives, damn it. Where the hell were you guys, giving out parking tickets?
When violence rules the city, when the police can't stop it, one man will, his way.
Watch out!
Charles Bronson.
Goodbye.
Death Wish.
I love movies, and throughout my life, I spent most of my time either commenting on politics online or in my more private online circle doing small capsule reviews of film. I wanted to integrate my interest in film onto YouTube, but I didn't want to split off into a separate channel. And also I didn't want to disrupt the core message of this channel, the moral purpose of this channel, so I decided to every so often do videos about the politics and ethics of particular films. For example, the other day, maybe 3 weeks ago, they announced that they were going to be resurrecting the Death Wish franchise with Bruce Willis. I'm not going to be that SJW that filters pop culture through exclusively through what I find problematic, because I don't think that's all there is to interpreting art or to interpreting culture. So, the remake aside, I do remember the original Death Wish films, one of which actually was released before I was born. At the beginning of this video, you'll see a trailer for one of the later sequels that was around when I was around, and was my first encounter with that franchise. Now, the first Death Wish film was extremely controversial because it was earnest. It was intended as a piece of right-wing political agitprop. Propaganda intended to sort of rally this NRA-type message towards crime. Of, the police having weapons is not enough, and you need to take the law into your own hands. There were implications of racism from the press, but the color of the assailants who actually victimize the family of Charles Bronson's main character in the first film, Paul Kersey, there are no black muggers in that scene. As a matter of fact, one of the muggers, played by Jeff Goldblum, is Jewish. So I think that Death Wish is more so about class and about the idea of the oppressed poor encroaching upon the safety of the comfortable, of the bourgeoisie, upper middle class, and wealthy neighborhoods. And I'm not saying that people from the street level committing crimes against wealthy people or well-to-do people is justified. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Stealing money to feed your family is different from raiding someone's house and sexually brutalizing their wife and daughter and then leaving them for dead. So I think that the racism that does exist within the Death Wish franchise, particularly in the most serious film, the first film, is informed by the post-apartheid nature of America and the fact that being poor and being black are going to just go together more often than being poor and being white in a country where historically black people had been disenfranchised financially. As I watch the evolution of that franchise, particularly because growing up, in the 80s, having been born in 81, obviously I was rooting for Charles Bronson, even though it seemed that he was killing people in my neighborhood. It seemed, people perceive Death Wish as having been anti-ghetto. And I think that the conservative right-wing fan base of that group perceived the idea of a white man going into a predominantly black neighborhood to correct crime as something heroic. There was, in fact, an incident on the subway in New York City where someone actually tried to, successfully pulled off a Death Wish-style self-defense. When they were being mugged on the subway, they pulled a gun and killed their attackers, who I believe were also young black men. So, the politics and ethics of Death Wish are interesting in that they started off very politically in the 1970s and very feeding this political narrative of every liberal, everyone's a liberal until they get mugged. I think that meme still is around today when people talk about, the women of Sweden, the white women of Sweden getting raped. The right wing always tries to push this narrative that you're only going to be progressive until one of the savages, attacks your family. Then you'll realize, like I do, what a threat they are. As the franchise went on, and again, this was from encountering these films first as a child with a very simplistic form of morality. I think that being a child, in a way, you kind of almost are, like, by default right-wing, because the right-wing's moral compass is very childlike in terms of being good guy, bad guy, bang, bang, bad guy, die. As those films went on, and they became tackier, and they became cheaper, they started to then market to, when Paramount, the major studio that produced the first two films, lost the rights to the franchise to Canon Films, who was a trash cinema production house, you ended up getting those films, the later Death Wish films were actually geared towards the audience in the inner city, like most cheap exploitation films are. It started to seem like, Bronson, especially by the time the fourth film came around, Bronson was attacking villains that everybody in the hood hated, which was to say upper-level drug traffickers who were bringing drugs into the neighborhood. So it's fascinating to watch Paul Kersey transform from the scourge of the inner city to a quasi-savior taking on the man by the time the fourth and final film in terms of theatrical release came around. There was a fifth film that went direct to video that wasn't particularly distinguished. It was like a cash out. But, you know, when I was a kid, I remember so many people in the inner city rooting for Bronson in these movies, because as they went on, it seemed like he was killing the people in the neighborhood that we didn't like. You know what I mean? He was no longer killing muggers in upper crust neighborhoods. He was coming to working class and poor neighborhoods and defending shopkeepers and you know, your average everyday working person from and again, there's still a fundamentally right-wing message that arcs through the franchise, which is like this NRA message of you have to be the cops are too soft, they're too liberal, and you have to take the gun into your own hands so that you can become the true face of just law and order with your gun and shooting down the bad guys. You can even remember this narrative from when we had the Sandy Hook massacre and a series of mass shootings. There was this talking point about a good guy with a gun is always more important than a bad guy. Is what you need in order to defeat a bad guy with a gun. So I think that these films can be, particularly the later films, can be processed as guilty pleasures. I think that as the franchise went on, the filmmakers, the producers of the franchise became more self-aware, and since they became more self-aware, there is a kind of a leeway for a progressive person to watch Death Wish in its cartoonish violence and still kind of be aware that, like, whether they like it or not, and this happened to Chuck Norris movies too, we'll come back to that too. What happened to right-wing propaganda between the beginning of the Reagan era and the end of the Reagan era was that it started to satirize itself. It started to become so exaggerated that by the time 1989 or 90 came around, all like the right-wing heroes of the 80s, Chuck Norris, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Bronson, ended up deconstructing their own politics and ended up just demonstrating how grotesque and silly the idea of the lone man against the savage, you know, the cowboy narrative really was.